What if I told you there was an ancient city so steeped in mystery that even its own destruction couldn't erase the whispers of its strangest secrets? Carthage, the mighty rival of Rome, the jewel of the Mediterranean, wasn't just a powerhouse of trade and war. Beneath its legendary battles and fiery downfall lies a shadowy tapestry of myths so bizarre they blur the line between history and the unbelievable. Imagine a place where children were said to be sacrificed to bronze gods, where sailors swore they saw ghost ships vanish into the mist, and where even the soil itself was rumored to be cursed. These aren't just tall tales, they're fragments of a civilization that thrived on the edge of myth, leaving behind puzzles that still haunt historians today. Carthage wasn't just another ancient empire. It was a cultural enigma, a city that rose from the shores of North Africa to challenge Rome's dominance, only to be erased so thoroughly that its enemies tried to salt the earth to ensure nothing would grow again. But legends have a way of surviving, sometimes in the most unexpected forms. For centuries, stories circulated about Carthaginian rituals so shocking they were dismissed as Roman propaganda, or treasures so well hidden they've never been found. Some of these myths are chilling, others are downright inexplicable, but all of them force us to ask, how much of what we think we know about Carthage is fact, and how much is fiction spun across millennia? Today, we're pulling back the veil on 25 of Carthage's most jaw-dropping myths, the kind that make you question everything you've heard about the ancient world. From whispered accounts of forbidden temples to the eerie fate of Carthage's most famous general, these stories aren't just footnotes in history. They're windows into a civilization that dared to defy the ordinary, leaving behind riddles that still captivate us. So if you're ready to dive into the shadows where history meets legend, where the line between truth and myth dissolves into whispers, let's begin, because Carthage's strangest secrets won't unravel themselves. One of the most unsettling legends surrounding Carthage is the claim that its people performed ritual sacrifices of infants to their god Baal. Ancient historians like Diodorus Siculus described horrific scenes, parents handing over their youngest children to be burned alive in the arms of a towering bronze statue, its outstretched hands glowing red-hot over the flames. For centuries, these accounts were dismissed as Roman propaganda, exaggerated to paint Carthage as barbaric. But then came the discoveries at the Tophet, a sacred burial ground just outside the city walls. Archaeologists uncovered thousands of urns containing tiny charred bones, many belonging to babies only weeks old. The inscriptions chillingly confirm it. These were offerings, not natural deaths. Yet the truth may be more complicated. Some scholars argue the Tophet was a cemetery for stillborn children or those who died young, their remains cremated as part of a mourning ritual rather than a sacrifice. Others point to animal bones mixed in, suggesting symbolic substitutions, but the sheer scale of the site raises haunting questions. Why would an entire civilization be accused of such an unthinkable act unless there was fire behind the smoke? The debate still rages, but one thing is certain, whether fact or slander, this myth clings to Carthage's memory like a shadow. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable idea that antiquity's greatest minds, mathematicians, sailors, merchants, might also have practiced something we find incomprehensible today. And that duality, the brilliance and the brutality, is what makes Carthage's legacy so unnerving. Hannibal's march across the Alps with his war elephants is one of history's most legendary feats, but how much of it was real, and how much was myth spun to terrify his enemies? Roman writers loved to paint the scene as something out of a nightmare. Carthaginian elephants trudging over impossible ice bridges conjured by sorcery, their massive feet never slipping as they descended into Italy like vengeful giants. The truth, though, was far messier and far more human. Hannibal didn't need magic to cross the mountains. He needed sheer, brutal determination. Picture this: 37 elephants, each weighing several tons, struggling through narrow mountain passes in freezing winds. Many didn't make it, some plunged off cliffs, their handlers unable to steer them on the crumbling paths. Others succumbed to cold or starvation, their bodies left behind as grim markers of the journey. The surviving animals were exhausted, their feet bloodied by the jagged terrain. This wasn't some supernatural parade, it was a desperate gamble by a general who knew surprise was his only advantage against Rome's superior numbers. So why did the myth of the magic bridges take hold? Partly because Rome couldn't fathom how their enemy had done the impossible. Later historians like Livy exaggerated the crossing into a near-miraculous event, turning Hannibal into a boogeyman who defied nature itself. Carthaginian records, though scarce, suggest a different story: meticulous planning, local guides, alpine paths used by traders, and even vinegar poured on boulders to crack them with frost. These were the real tricks behind the crossing. But facts rarely survive as vividly as legends. The image of elephants looming out of the snow, unstoppable and otherworldly, was far more terrifying and far easier for Rome to weaponize. In the end, the truth is almost as astounding as the myth. Hannibal didn't need magic to shake the ancient world. He just needed the audacity to try what everyone else thought was suicide, and the will to keep marching when the mountains tried to break him. That's the real story buried beneath 2,000 years of legend. Carthage's naval harbor wasn't just a feat of engineering, it was so advanced some swore it could vanish at will. Ancient writers like Strabo described a near-magical sight, an enormous circular port hidden behind towering walls, its inner docks shielded from prying eyes. The entrance was deliberately narrow, barely wide enough for a single ship to slip through, making the harbor invisible from the open sea. But the real marvel. Inside, the Carthaginians built not one, but two concentric rings of docks. The outer ring handled trade ships, while the inner ring, guarded like a state secret, housed Carthage's legendary war fleet. The most astonishing detail: rotating wooden platforms connected the rings, allowing ships to pivot silently between them. Imagine a Roman spy scaling the outer walls at night, expecting to count the fleet, only to find half the vessels seemingly gone. No wonder rumors spread that the harbor could disappear. Its design was a masterclass in deception. Even Strabo, usually a skeptic, wrote about it with unmistakable awe, calling it a wonder unlike any other. But here's the twist: the harbor's invisibility wasn't supernatural. It was pure ingenuity. By controlling sight lines and movement, Carthage turned logistics into psychological warfare. Enemies couldn't assess their naval strength, making every ship that emerged a potential surprise. And when Rome finally breached the city in 146 BC, they were stunned to find the harbor intact, proof that its greatest magic was how well it fooled the world. The myths didn't exaggerate its brilliance, they just couldn't believe it was man-made. The story goes that when Rome finally crushed Carthage in 146 BC, they didn't just burn the city, they salted the earth, ensuring nothing would ever grow there again. It's a haunting image, soldiers systematically scattering bitter white crystals over the smoldering ruins, cursing the land with barrenness for eternity. This tale has echoed through centuries, becoming shorthand for total annihilation, from medieval sieges to modern warfare. But here's the twist: there's zero proof it actually happened. Roman historians like Pliny and Plutarch never mention it. The first reference appears 700 years later in a passing comment by a medieval scholar. So why did this myth take root? Because it felt true. Rome wanted Carthage erased, not just defeated. They demolished every building, forbade reconstruction, and reportedly even drew plows over the ruins to symbolically unfound the city. Salting the earth, whether literal or not, became the perfect metaphor for that obliteration, a poetic flourish that crystallized Rome's ruthless determination. But the real irony: Carthage did rise again. A century later, Julius Caesar rebuilt it as a Roman colony, and it thrived for centuries. The land wasn't cursed, it was too valuable to abandon. Yet the myth persists because it captures something deeper than history. Our fascination with the idea of a victory so complete, it twists the natural order. Even now, phrases like salting the earth describe corporate takeovers or political scorched earth tactics. Carthage's curse endures not as fact, but as a warning, one that reminds us how easily destruction can become legend. Among the wildest rumors spread about Carthage was the claim that its people worshipped a monstrous serpent god, a slithering deity demanding blood sacrifices in shadowy temples. Roman writers loved to amplify these tales, portraying Punic religion as something dark and alien, crawling with snake cults and unspeakable rites. But dig deeper, and the truth reveals a fascinating clash between reality and exotic fear-mongering. The real Carthaginian pantheon centered on powerful but recognizable figures like Baal, the sky god, and Tanit, his consort often depicted with a crescent moon symbol, not a serpent. Excavated stelae showed Tanit as a serene, maternal figure, her arms outstretched in blessing. Yet Roman accounts insist Carthaginians bowed before a great serpent coiled upon an altar, a detail that suspiciously echoes their own myths about foreign barbarians. The confusion likely stems from a mix of deliberate exaggeration and misinterpretation. For example, archaeologists have found serpent motifs in Carthaginian art, but never as a central deity. Snakes appeared as symbols of healing or protection, much like Asclepius in Greek culture. One famous amulet shows a serpent twined around a staff, possibly linked to medicine. But Roman historians, eager to paint Carthage as sinister, spun these subtle symbols into lurid fantasies. It's no accident that their descriptions of Punic rituals grew more outlandish after the Punic Wars, when demonizing the enemy served political ends. The irony, Rome itself had serpent deities like the benevolent Glycon, but Carthage snakes were always framed as malevolent, playing into stereotypes of African otherness. This wasn't just religious slander, it was propaganda designed to make annihilation seem justified. So next time you hear about Carthage, serpent god, remember, sometimes the most venomous thing in history isn't the myth but the hand that wrote it. Deep beneath the streets of Carthage, whispers persist of a fortune so vast it could have bankrolled another war against Rome, the legendary lost treasure of the Barcids, Hannibal's infamous family. Stories tell of secret tunnels snaking under the city, their walls lined with gold plundered from Spanish mines and Sicilian temples, all hidden away for the day Carthage would rise again. It's the kind of tale that sets treasure hunters' hearts racing, but how much is history and how much is the glitter of wishful thinking? The Barcids were undeniably wealthy. Hannibal's father, Hamilcar, secured silver-rich territories in Spain, and ancient accounts describe caravans of treasure flowing back to Carthage. Roman historians, never shy about exaggerating Punic riches, claim the Barcids could field armies with just the interest from their hoard. But here's where myth and reality diverge. While Carthage's trade networks were legendary, the idea of a single family stash big enough to rebuild an empire strains credibility. Most historians argue the Barcids' wealth was tied up in ships, mercenaries, and political alliances, not buried in some subterranean vault. That hasn't stopped centuries of speculation. Medieval mapmakers scribbled cryptic markers where the treasure might lie, and modern expeditions have scoured the ruins of Carthage with ground-penetrating radar, turning up empty-handed. The most tantalizing clue, a 1st-century text mentioning Barcid gold smuggled out during the city's fall, but even that likely refers to scattered bribes, not a unified trove. The real treasure might be less about gold and more about legacy. The Barcids' true wealth was their audacity, their ability to rally nations against Rome with little more than sheer will. So why does the myth endure? Because every great dynasty deserves a pirate-worthy ending. A chest of glittering what-ifs waiting just beyond reach. Carthage's defeat was so total, so final, that we can't help but imagine a secret still buried beneath the ashes, one last trick Hannibal never got to play. And maybe that's the point. The treasure isn't lost, it's the story itself, polished brighter with each retelling. Of all the myths clinging to Carthage, few are as fantastical as the claim that this real-world empire was secretly tied to Plato's lost Atlantis. The theory goes something like this. Both were maritime superpowers that met catastrophic ends. Both were said to wield technology ahead of their time, and both vanished so completely they might as well have sunk beneath the waves. Some even point to Carthage's circular harbor as a match for Atlantis's concentric rings. It's a seductive idea, but dig deeper, and the cracks in this theory gape wide enough to swallow an entire continent. Plato's Atlantis was pure allegory, a cautionary tale about hubris wrapped in mythical trappings. He never claimed it was real. His dialogues explicitly frame it as a philosophical parable. The similarities with Carthage rely on cherry-picking. Yes, both had advanced navies, but so did Athens and Phoenicia. Yes, both suffered dramatic downfalls, but Carthage's destruction in 146 BC was meticulously documented, while Atlantis's fate exists only in moralistic fiction. The circular harbor comparison. Carthage's design was an engineering marvel, not some mystical blueprint. Historians universally dismiss this link as pseudo-archaeology. Dr. Richard Miles, an expert on Carthage, calls it a classic case of pattern-seeking, connecting dots that were never on the same page. Even the timelines clash violently. Plato wrote about Atlantis around 360 BC, centuries after Carthage was already a thriving power. The myth likely persists because it taps into our love of conspiratorial connections, the idea that history's greatest mysteries must secretly intertwine. But here's the real twist. The Atlantis-Carthage theory says more about us than antiquity. We project our longing for lost worlds onto real civilizations, blurring fact and fantasy until the past feels grander, stranger. Carthage doesn't need Atlantis to be fascinating. Its true story of innovation, resilience, and a rivalry that reshaped the Mediterranean is epic enough without grafting on someone else's myth. So why does this idea still slither into documentaries and forums? Because some legends refuse to die, especially when they promise hidden truths lurking just beneath history's surface. The irony: Carthage's actual secrets, its submerged shipwrecks, its untranslated texts are far more electrifying than any phantom alliance. Atlantis may be fiction, but Carthage's reality. That's the true enigma worth solving. Carthage's wealth didn't just come from gold or silver, it flowed from something far stranger: the tears of sea snails. The famed Tyrian purple dye, worth its weight in silver, was extracted from the mucus of murex shellfish, a process so labor-intensive it took 12,000 snails to produce a single ounce of pigment. But to the ancient world, this wasn't just chemistry, it was magic. Whispers spread that the dye was a divine gift, its vibrant hue drawn from the very blood of gods. Some even claimed the snails wept colored tears as they were crushed, their sacrifice imbuing the fabric with supernatural brilliance. The truth was both less mystical and more extraordinary. Carthaginian artisans mastered a fermentation technique, soaking the snail's glands in salt water for days until the liquid transformed into a deep, radiant purple. The smell was horrific. Ancient texts describe whole neighborhoods reeking of rotting seafood, but the result was irresistible. This wasn't just a color. It was power. Roman senators clamored for it, pharaohs wrapped themselves in it, and Carthage merchants grew obscenely rich controlling its trade. So why the myth? Because rarity breeds legend. The dye's astronomical cost, Pliny claimed a pound could buy a villa, made it seem otherworldly, and the process was so secretive, outsiders spun wild theories. One Greek historian insisted the snails grew only where Poseidon had struck his trident, while others swore the dye shimmered differently in sunlight, proof it was touched by the divine. Even the name Tyrian purple became a kind of incantation, evoking luxury beyond mortal reach. But here's the twist: the real magic wasn't in the myths. It was in Carthage's ruthless monopoly. By controlling the murex beds off North Africa, they turned a sluggish mollusk into an empire's foundation. The snails didn't weep tears of gold. Carthage did every time another kingdom paid a fortune for what was at its heart just fermented sea slime. That's the alchemy of trade. Take something ordinary, wrap it in mystery, and watch the world pay to believe. Among the strangest myths Roman writers spread about Carthage was the tale of a cursed mirror, one that supposedly reflected not the viewer's face, but the fiery destruction of Rome itself. This so-called prophetic mirror was said to hang in the darkest corner of a Punic temple, whispering doom to anyone who dared gaze into its polished bronze surface. The story goes that Carthaginian priests would force captured Roman soldiers to look into it, promising the terrified men they'd see their homeland in flames. It's a gripping image, but like so much of Carthage's mythology, the truth is buried under layers of Roman mockery and political theater. The mirror first appears in the works of satirists like Juvenal, who used it as a punchline to skewer Carthaginian superstition. His account drips with irony. The mirror was supposedly forged from melted-down Roman shields, its surface so cursed it could only show lies. But here's the catch: no Carthaginian texts or archaeological evidence mention such an object. In reality, Punic divination relied on far more practical methods, like reading animal entrails or interpreting the flight patterns of birds. The famous haruspices, or liver readers, were highly trained priests who analyzed the organs of sacrificed sheep for irregularities, believing the gods communicated through every lobe and crevice. So why invent a magical mirror? Because it served Rome's narrative. By painting Carthaginians as deluded mystics clutching at phantom omens, Roman writers undermined their enemies' sophistication. The mirror became a literary device, a way to flip Carthage's reputation as master strategists into foolish fortune-tellers. The irony: Rome itself was deeply superstitious. Emperors consulted Sibylline prophecies, and armies postponed battles over bad bird signs. But history is written by the victors, and Carthage's divination practices were recast as laughable hocus-pocus, while Rome's identical rituals were framed as pious tradition. The real prophecy lurking here isn't in bronze reflections, it's in the way myths reshape memory. That mirror didn't predict Rome's fall, but the story of it. That predicted exactly how Carthage would be remembered, not as a civilization of astronomers and engineers, but as a cautionary tale scribbled in the margins of history by its conquerors. Sometimes the most powerful curses aren't cast in temples, they're woven into the stories told about the defeated. Even after Carthage fell, its greatest general refused to stay buried, at least in the imagination of his enemies. The legend goes that Scipio Africanus, the Roman hero who defeated Hannibal at Zama, spent his final years haunted by the specter of his old rival. Livy spins it like a tragic play, Scipio tossing in his sleep as Hannibal's ghost materializes at his bedside, whispering taunts about fleeting glory and the fickleness of fate. It's a gripping scene, but peel back the drama, and you'll find this ghost story wasn't about Carthage at all. It was Rome's own guilt draped in Punic robes. The timing says everything. By the time Livy wrote his account 2 centuries later, Scipio's legacy was already tarnished. Once celebrated as Rome's savior, he'd been driven into exile by political rivals, dying far from the city he'd defended. The haunting myth served as poetic justice, a way to frame his downfall as divine retribution for hubris. Notice the details. Livy's Hannibal doesn't threaten or curse. He simply reminds Scipio that all greatness fades, a mirror held up to Rome's own anxieties about power. This wasn't Carthaginian vengeance, it was a Roman morality play wearing Hannibal's face. Archaeology backs the skepticism. No contemporary sources mention these hauntings. The story blooms fully formed in later histories, steeped in theatrical tropes. Roman literature loved using ghosts as mouthpieces. Think of Pompey's spectre chastising Caesar in Lucan's poems. The haunting follows the same template. A fallen foe returns not to frighten but to philosophize, turning military victory into a spiritual defeat. Even the setting reeks of staging. Scipio's supposed breakdown occurs in Litanum, his retirement villa, a place Livy describes as gloomy and remote, the perfect backdrop for a ghost story. But here's what's fascinating. The myth almost makes historical sense. Hannibal and Scipio did share a strange bond. They met privately before Zama, exchanging mutual admiration, and Polybius records Hannibal later visiting Scipio in Ephesus, where they debated the greatest generals in history. That real warmth makes Livy's ghost feel even more contrived. Why twist a nuanced relationship into a cheap parable? Because Rome needed Hannibal as a boogeyman long after his death. The haunting wasn't about the past, it was a warning to future conquerors. Glory, like ghosts, is never as solid as it seems. The real horror here isn't specters. It's how history gets rewritten to fit the victor's fears. Hannibal never haunted Scipio, but Rome, it never stopped haunting itself. Carthage's walls weren't just sturdy, they were so colossal, later generations swore they'd been built by giants. Stretching over 20 miles around the city, these fortifications rose 3 layers high, each tier bristling with defensive towers so thick, chariots could reportedly race along their tops. Ancient historians like Appian gasped at their scale, describing outer walls nearly 30 feet thick, faced with limestone blocks so massive, no ordinary human could have lifted them. Even Rome, Carthage's fiercest rival, begrudgingly admitted these barriers were impregnable until they weren't. The giant myth didn't come from nowhere. Similar legends clung to other Mediterranean megaliths, like Greece's Cyclopean walls, where later cultures assumed only one-eyed monsters could heave such boulders. But Carthage's builders had no need for mythic strength, just brutal ingenuity. Archaeological digs reveal the secret: ramps, levers, and an army of enslaved laborers. The stones were quarried nearby, hauled on wooden sledges greased with animal fat, then locked into place with dovetail joints that needed no mortar. The real marvel wasn't supernatural force, it was logistics. Thousands of workers, organized in shifts, could move mountains when driven by the whip and the fear of Rome's advancing legions. What truly fed the giant tales, though, was the psychological impact. Standing before those walls, enemies felt tiny. The triple layers weren't just physical barriers, they were stages of terror. Attackers breaching the first wall would find themselves trapped in a killing zone between the second and third, rained on with arrows and boiling oil from above. No wonder desperate refugees, seeing the ruins centuries later, spun stories of titanic builders. When ordinary humans tear down something that monumental, it's easier to blame gods or monsters than admit what people are capable of, both in creation and destruction. The irony, those legendary walls fell not to brute force but to starvation. Rome's siege in 146 BC lasted 3 years, with Carthaginians eating rats and leather before their defenses cracked. The giants didn't abandon them. They were outlasted. Today, fragments of those walls still jut from Tunisian soil, not as proof of mythical craftsmen, but as monuments to the very human mix of ambition and desperation that built them. And maybe that's the real lesson. History's most awe-inspiring feats aren't magic. They're just sweat, fear, and the refusal to be forgotten. When Roman sailors whispered about Carthaginian ships vanishing under the eerie glow of a full moon, they weren't just spinning campfire tales, they were grappling with an enemy who weaponized the night itself. Legends swirled that Tanit, Carthage's moon goddess, stretched silver fingers across the waves to guide her people's fleets and blind their foes. Coins minted in Carthage show her crowned with a crescent, a celestial promise of protection. But the truth behind these myths reveals something far more cunning than divine intervention. Carthage's admirals didn't rely on magic. They mastered the moon's light like a tactical tool. Picture this: under cover of darkness, Carthaginian vessels stripped their sails to blackened cloth, their hulls painted to blend with the obsidian sea. While Roman ships anchored clumsily in formation, Punic captains used the moon's phases to time their strikes. A full moon meant visibility for their expert navigators, but not for their targets. They'd strike from the shadows, launching fire ships rigged with tar-soaked logs toward Roman fleets, the flames reflecting off the water like a false dawn. By the time Rome's lookouts spotted the danger, their sails were already catching sparks. The moon goddess myth likely sprang from these psychological gambits. Ancient accounts describe Roman crews panicking as Carthaginian boats seemed to materialize from nowhere, their flags bearing Tanit, symbol catching the moonlight just before impact. Even Polybius, usually a stickler for facts, noted how Punic sailors moved, as if the night itself obeyed them. The real secret: celestial navigation. Carthaginians mapped stars with precision, using the moon's position to coordinate attacks with chilling synchronicity. Archaeology backs this up. Wreckage from Carthaginian warships reveals telltale clues: lanterns with adjustable shutters to control light leakage, moon phase almanacs etched into navigation tablets. These weren't rituals, they were military manuals, and those Tanit coins, far from talismans, they were propaganda, projecting an image of divine favor to unnerve enemies. The moon didn't sink Roman ships, but the legend that it did, that was Carthage's most brilliant deception. A blend of astronomy, psychology, and showmanship that turned celestial mechanics into a weapon of war. The irony: Rome eventually copied these tactics, crediting their own gods for the strategy. But history remembers the original architects not as tacticians, but as pawns of a moon goddess. Perhaps that's the ultimate victory. When your enemy can't comprehend your genius, they'll call it magic instead. One persistent myth claims the Carthaginians single-handedly invented the alphabet, a feat so revolutionary it's often framed as their gift to the world. But history, like the script itself, is more layered than that. The truth: Carthage didn't create the alphabet. They inherited it, refined it, and spread it through trade like ink on parchment. Yet their role was part of a much older story. The so-called Punic script used in Carthage was a direct descendant of Phoenician writing, a system born centuries earlier in the Levant. Side-by-side comparisons reveal the lineage. Both scripts shared the same angular, consonant-heavy characters, designed for efficiency in merchant ledgers and ship manifests. But here's where confusion creeps in. Because Carthage dominated Mediterranean trade, their version of the script became synonymous with Punic culture, blurring its origins. A 5th century Greek historian even credited Libyan scribes, likely Carthaginian, with teaching the alphabet to the world, erasing its Phoenician roots. Archaeology sets the record straight. The oldest known Phoenician inscriptions, like the sarcophagus of King Ahram in Byblos, predate Carthage's founding by at least 300 years. These early carvings already show the hallmarks of the system Carthage would later adopt: 22 letters written right to left with no vowels. Carthaginian tweaks were practical, not revolutionary. They simplified certain glyphs for faster carving on stelae and added ligatures for common trade terms. Why does this myth endure? Partly because Carthage's maritime empire made their script ubiquitous. From Sardinia to Spain, Punic inscriptions marked trade outposts, creating the illusion of invention. But the real credit belongs to the Phoenicians, whose coastal cities Tyre, Sidon, Byblos perfected the alphabet as early as 1000 BCE. Carthage's genius wasn't creation. It was adaptation, turning a shared inheritance into the glue of their commercial empire. The irony: Rome later borrowed this alphabet too, reshaping it into Latin. So while Carthage didn't invent the letters, they helped weave them into the fabric of history. One ship's manifest, one treaty, one cursed tablet at a time. The script outlived the city, proving that some legacies aren't about being first. They're about being unforgettable. Beneath Carthage's bustling streets, whispers persist of a shadowy world, a network of tunnels so vast some swore it rivaled the legendary labyrinth of Crete. Ancient chroniclers spun tales of secret passages snaking under temples, connecting palaces to hidden vaults, even stretching beyond the city walls to smuggle treasures from Rome's grasp. It's the kind of myth that ignites imaginations, conjuring images of torchlit corridors and echoes of lost footsteps. But the truth, as always, is half as fantastical and twice as fascinating. Archaeology confirms Carthage did have underground spaces, just not the mythic mazes of legend. The city's engineers built sprawling cisterns to store precious rainwater, their vaulted ceilings engineered to withstand earthquakes. These weren't dark dungeons but marvels of practicality, with filtration systems so advanced they inspired Roman design centuries later. Then there were the sewers, wide enough for maintenance workers to navigate, channeling waste away from public spaces with startling efficiency for the ancient world. So where did the labyrinth myth take root? Partly from later visitors misinterpreting these functional structures. When early archaeologists unearthed sections of the cisterns, their interconnected chambers and branching paths resembled something out of a minotaur's tale. But the real spark came from Carthage's catacombs. Discovered in the 19th century, these burial tunnels adorned with Punic and Roman-era frescoes were repurposed over centuries, their layers of use creating a palimpsest of the dead. To explorers brushing off centuries of dust, it must have felt like stumbling into a forgotten underworld. The irony, Carthage labyrinths were never meant to hide monsters or gold. They were solutions to thirst, to sanitation, to honoring ancestors. Yet the myths persist because they reveal something deeper, our hunger to believe that beneath every great city, there's a secret waiting to be uncovered. Carthage's real genius wasn't in building mazes, it was in making the mundane feel monumental, and sometimes that's enough to birth a legend. Deep in the heart of Carthage's sacred precincts, travelers whispered of a grove so cursed its very trees wept blood. Ancient historians like Plutarch and Diodorus spun lurid tales of gnarled oaks dripping crimson sap, their roots nourished by sacrifices to Baal. Roman audiences shuddered at descriptions of priests slitting throats over twisted roots, their blades glinting as the earth drank the offerings. It's the kind of story designed to horrify, but peel back the layers and you'll find a mix of ecological reality, ritual practice, and calculated propaganda. Archaeology offers a more mundane explanation. The blood likely came from two sources. First, the grove's soil, rich in iron oxide, would have turned runoff water a rusty red, especially after rains. Second, animal sacrifices common in Punic rituals left behind traces of blood that pooled around tree roots, staining the ground. Modern excavations at Carthage temple complexes reveal drainage channels designed to funnel ritual runoff away from sacred spaces, suggesting the Carthaginians themselves were practical about managing the mess of devotion. But Rome didn't want practicality, they wanted monsters. The bloody grove myth fit neatly into their narrative of Carthage as a land of unnatural rites. Roman writers amplified every macabre detail, ignoring similar traditions in their own culture, like the Lupercalia festival where priests smeared blood on spectators' foreheads. The difference, context: Rome's rituals were framed as pious, Carthage became grotesque. Even the choice of trees mattered. Oaks, sacred to Jupiter, bleeding under foreign gods, made the story feel like a perversion of Roman values. The truth, as often with Carthage, lies somewhere between earth and invention. Yes, the grove likely existed. Temples across the ancient Mediterranean featured sacred trees. And yes, blood from sacrifices may have mingled with the soil, but the horror story version, that was Rome turning ecology into epic, transforming iron-rich earth and butchered lambs into proof of a civilization gone mad. The real curse wasn't in the grove, it was in the ink of historians who knew a chilling tale could outlast any truth. The idea that Carthaginians were the original black pirates preying on Mediterranean shipping is a myth tangled in centuries of misrepresentation, one that says more about 19th century racism than ancient history. While Carthage sailors were certainly feared, their reputation wasn't built on piracy. It was built on something far more sophisticated: control. This mislabeling stems from a lazy conflation with the later Barbary pirates of North Africa, who emerged over 1,000 years after Carthage's fall. The distortion didn't happen by accident. It was a deliberate rewriting to fit colonial-era stereotypes, painting the entire region as inherently lawless and exotic. Carthage's real maritime power came from its vast trade networks, not plunder. Ancient sources like Polybius described their fleets as floating warehouses, laden with Spanish silver, Sardinian grain, and Tyrian purple dye. Their ships were so ubiquitous, Greek playwrights joked that you could smell Carthaginian perfume before their sails even appeared on the horizon. Piracy. Hardly. Carthage punished rogue captains harshly. They couldn't afford chaos disrupting their carefully negotiated trade treaties. When they did use naval force, it was calculated, like blockading rival ports or protecting shipping lanes from actual pirates. So why the pirate myth? Blame Orientalist fantasies. By the 1800s, European writers were obsessed with framing North Africa as a land of turbaned raiders, ignoring its complex history. Carthage, with its African roots and maritime dominance, got swept into this caricature. Paintings from the era show Carthaginian galleys with exaggerated, almost monstrous designs, crewed by figures straight out of a pirate melodrama, a far cry from the real fleet's disciplined multicultural crews. Even the term Black Pirates is a giveaway. Carthaginians ranged from Berber to Phoenician to Greek in ancestry, but 19th century artists and authors flattened them into a single, sinister other. The irony: Rome, not Carthage, had the worst pirate problem. The Mediterranean's golden age of piracy came after Carthage's destruction, when Rome's neglect of naval patrols let pirate kingdoms flourish. Yet history remembers Carthage as the predator, not the protector. That's the danger of myths. They don't just distort the past. They bury the truth under layers of prejudice, leaving us with a story where the real villains fade into the shadows and the misunderstood wear the black hats. Of all the sacred mysteries in Carthage, none burned as brightly in the imagination as the so-called eternal flame of Tanit, a fire said to have flickered ceaselessly in the goddess's temple, defying nature with its unyielding glow. Ancient travelers swore the flame never dimmed, even during storms or sieges, its light a symbol of Tanit's unbreakable covenant with her people. Some claimed it was divine intervention, a sliver of the sun itself captured in bronze. Others whispered the fire fed on something far darker: secret offerings tossed into its depths at midnight. But archaeology and a close reading of temple records reveal a truth far more ingenious. This was no miracle. It was masterful engineering disguised as magic. The key lay in the temple's design. Excavations at Carthage Biasa Hill uncovered a network of concealed vents and underground channels, cleverly funneling steady drafts to the sacred hearth. Priests maintained a stockpile of slow-burning olive wood and animal fats, replenishing the flames in shifts to create the illusion of an unbroken blaze. Similar systems appear in temples across the ancient world, most famously in Rome's Temple of Vesta, where the Vestal Virgins guarded their own eternal fire. But while Rome's flame was a political symbol, Tanit served a deeper psychological purpose. To a city built on trade and seafaring, a fire that never died wasn't just ritual. It was a beacon of stability in an unpredictable world, a promise that Carthage would endure as surely as the flame itself. The parallels to Vesta's fire are striking, but the differences speak volumes. Roman sources framed their eternal flame as a civic duty, its upkeep tied to the state's survival. Carthage's fire, by contrast, was woven into the fabric of daily worship. Inscriptions describe ordinary citizens bringing oil as offerings to feed the flame, blurring the line between sacred and practical, and where Rome's fire occasionally guttered, leading to panic and purification rites. Carthage priests turned maintenance into theater. Accounts from Greek merchants describe hooded figures tending the flames in synchronized movements, their actions so precise that observers swore the fire renewed itself. But why the myth of supernatural endurance? Because Carthage's identity thrived on paradox. A city of merchants who doubled as warriors, of pragmatic engineers who cloaked their genius in mysticism. The eternal flame was the perfect metaphor, a feat of human skill disguised as divine favor. When Rome finally sacked Carthage, legend insists the flame hissed its last breath, but even that detail feels staged. More likely, the priests let it die dramatically, a final act of defiance. After all, the greatest trick isn't keeping a fire burning forever. It's convincing your enemies you could. Hannibal's final act was as calculated as his Alpine crossing. If the legends are to be believed, the story goes that when Roman forces finally cornered him in exile, the aging general bit into a poison-filled ring, choosing death over humiliation. It's the kind of dramatic exit that feels ripped from a tragedy, the fallen hero defiant to the last, cheating his enemies of their triumph. Even Plutarch, writing centuries later, couldn't resist painting the scene with theatrical flourish. Hannibal's final words reportedly mocking Rome's inability to kill him themselves. But strip away the drama and you'll find a death as ambiguous as Hannibal's legacy itself. Historical accounts agree on the broad strokes. By 182 BC, Hannibal was a hunted man. After years of advising rival kingdoms against Rome, he'd become so symbolic of resistance that the Senate dispatched agents to track him down. Cornered in Bithynia, he supposedly unleashed that poison ring, but here's where fact blurs. Ancient sources like Livy and Nepos mention poison but never describe the ring itself. The embellishment likely sprang from later biographers enchanted by the idea of Hannibal outwitting Rome one final time. What better metaphor than a hidden weapon tucked in plain sight like his strategies at Cannae? The ring myth also served a deeper narrative purpose. Rome needed Hannibal's death to feel inevitable yet noble, a fitting end for a worthy adversary. A messy assassination would have made them look vengeful, a surrender anticlimactic. But suicide by clandestine poison that let both sides save face. Hannibal remained the untamed genius too proud for chains, while Rome could claim they'd hounded him to his grave without dirtying their hands. Even the poison's alleged source, a stash he'd carried for years, hinted at premeditation, turning his death into the last move of a lifelong chess game. Archaeology offers a sobering counterpoint. No poison ring has ever been found, and Greco-Roman medical texts describe similar suicides using hemlock or aconite substances that wouldn't fit neatly inside jewelry. More plausible, Hannibal drank poison from a vial, a common method for elite suicides, but the ring stuck in popular imagination because it echoed his reputation, the general who always had one last trick. The real genius of this myth isn't in the details. It's in how it crystallizes Hannibal's enduring mystique. Whether he died biting metal or sipping from a cup, the story insists on one unshakable truth: that even in defeat he controlled his fate. That's the ultimate defiance, and why 2,000 years later, we're still debating whether the ring was history or just the perfect final lie. Rumors swirled among ancient sailors that Carthaginian ships were dipped in dragon's blood, a mystical coating that made their hulls impervious to storms and enemy fire. Greek poets spun vivid tales of vessels gliding through tempests untouched, their prows gleaming crimson as if painted with the very essence of mythical beasts. Even Pliny the Elder, ever the skeptic, couldn't resist repeating the claim, musing that Carthage's naval dominance must stem from some otherworldly protectant. But the truth behind this scaly legend wasn't plucked from monster lore. It was scraped from pine trees and mixed under the Mediterranean sun. The real dragon's blood was a carefully guarded recipe of pine tar, beeswax, and ochre pigment, a concoction so effective it might as well have been magic. Workers in Carthage shipyards would heat the sticky blend until it bubbled, then daub it onto hulls in thick, fire-red layers. The result, a waterproof seal that repelled barnacles, slowed rot, and crucially made ships glide faster by reducing drag. To enemy eyes, these crimson-hulled warships slicing through waves must have seemed supernatural, especially when arrows bounced off their slick surfaces. The myth took root because the alternative, that Carthage artisans had simply out-engineered everyone else, was harder to swallow. Archaeology backs the ingenuity. Excavated ship remnants near Lilybaeum, a key Carthaginian port, revealed traces of this exact mixture preserved in wood fibers. Modern tests show it's remarkably close to today's marine coatings, with the beeswax preventing brittleness and the ochre acting as a natural antifungal. But the true stroke of genius was psychological. By letting rivals believe in dragon's blood, Carthage turned practical chemistry into a weapon of fear. Imagine being a Roman sailor watching those blood-red ships close in, wondering if your weapons could even scratch them. That's the power of a well-placed myth. It wins battles before the first arrow flies. The irony, Rome eventually stole the recipe, rebranding it as their own Pix Navales without a whisper of dragons. Carthage's real legacy wasn't in fairy tales. It was in understanding that sometimes the most potent magic is just science wrapped in a story, and in the ancient world that was enough to make an empire float. The night sky over Carthage split open with what many believed was a sign from the gods, a blazing meteor streaking toward the earth just months before Rome's final siege. Ancient historians like Cassius Dio recorded the event in ominous tones, describing how the fiery star crashed into the sea near the city, sending waves sloshing onto the docks as if the ocean itself recoiled. To superstitious observers, it was an undeniable omen. The heavens had marked Carthage for destruction, but strip away the drama and you're left with a collision of natural phenomena and human desperation, where a falling rock became the ultimate scapegoat for a war that was already inevitable. Meteors held terrifying significance in the ancient world. Romans called them duri, or dreadful portents, and their appearance often triggered panic. Just a decade earlier, a meteorite strike in Greece had sent the Roman Senate scrambling to consult the Sibylline books for guidance. Carthage, with its own tradition of celestial divination, would have read the skies just as carefully. The irony, there's not a single Carthaginian account of this meteor. Every mention comes from Roman or Greek sources, all written after the city's fall. It's as if the meteor only existed to serve as a cosmic justification for what Rome had already decided to do: erase Carthage from the map. Astronomy offers a simpler explanation. The Mediterranean's lurid meteor shower peaks every April, and historical records show heightened activity around 150 BCE. A particularly bright fireball could easily have been misinterpreted as a singular, earth-shattering event. But Rome, fresh from decades of war with Carthage, had every reason to spin it as destiny. Imagine the propaganda value. Even the gods hurled stones at our enemies. The real tragedy isn't whether the meteor was real. It's how myths like these let history's winners frame conquest as fate. Carthage's destruction wasn't written in the stars. It was written in Senate decrees and military ledgers. Yet 2 millennia later, we're still parsing celestial coincidences as if they held the answers. Perhaps that's the most enduring omen of all. Our need to believe that empires fall because the universe demands it, not because humanity chooses violence again and again. Among the most tantalizing myths about Carthage is the legend of a fierce queen leading an army of Amazon-style warriors, a story that blends fragments of truth with outright fantasy. At its heart sits Dido, Carthage's legendary founder, who ancient writers like Virgil transformed from a shrewd political exile into a sword-wielding ruler surrounded by female bodyguards. Later Roman and medieval chroniclers couldn't resist adding layers, describing Carthaginian noblewomen charging into battle with spears, their hair braided like Celtic berserkers. It's a gripping image, but archaeology and contemporary records paint a far more nuanced picture of power, one where Carthage's women wielded influence without ever needing a shield. Start with Dido herself. The earliest Phoenician accounts, echoed by Greek historians like Timaeus, describe her as Elissa, a Tyrian princess who fled her murderous brother with a loyal retinue, bartered for land, hence the famous oxhide trick, and established Carthage as a trading powerhouse. Not a single ancient source mentions her bearing arms. The warrior queen version emerged centuries later, when Roman poets needed a dramatic foil for Aeneas in the Aeneid. Virgil's Dido is a tempest of emotions, at one point threatening to burn Troy's hero alive in a pyre, a far cry from the strategic diplomat of earlier texts. Then there's the so-called Amazon Corps. While Carthage did have female elites, inscriptions name wealthy merchant queens like Baal and Eshmunetun who financed temples and fleets. There's zero evidence of women in combat roles. Even the famed Tanit cult, though female-centric, focused on fertility and commerce, not warfare. The myth likely sprang from Greek encounters with Berber tribes, where women occasionally fought alongside men, and Roman shock at Carthage's relative gender equality. Unlike Rome, where women couldn't even enter the Senate, Punic women could inherit property, run businesses, and serve as priestesses. That autonomy, misread through a lens of exoticism, became fodder for fantasies. The distortion reveals more about the storytellers than the subjects. Rome's patriarchal culture struggled to reconcile Carthage's powerful women with their own rigid norms, so they recast them as warlike anomalies. Medieval chroniclers doubled down, blending Dido with Celtic warrior queens like Boudica. Yet the real story is far more revolutionary, a civilization where women could shape history without picking up a sword. Their power wasn't in brute force, but in the quiet calculus of trade networks and temple donations, the kind of influence that doesn't make epic poems but builds empires. So next time you hear about Carthage Amazons, remember, sometimes the most subversive truth isn't a woman with a weapon. It's a woman with a ledger. Roman soldiers whispered in dread about Carthaginian warriors who fought with unnatural resilience, men who shrugged off wounds that should have felled them, their bodies allegedly shielded by tiny bronze charms inscribed with the twisted symbols of Baal. Ancient historians like Livy leaned into these tales, describing how Punic fighters clutched their amulets mid-battle, their lips moving in silent prayers as enemy blades somehow always found metal instead of flesh. It's the kind of myth that turns practical superstition into battlefield magic, but archaeology reveals a far more human truth behind these so-called invincibility charms. The real, Baal-blessed amulets were neither magical nor unique. Excavations at Carthaginian military sites have uncovered hundreds of these tokens, small pendants typically cast in bronze or carved from bone, often depicting protective deities like Baal Hammon or Tanit. Far from granting supernatural protection, they functioned much like the Christian crosses or Egyptian Eye of Horus charms carried by soldiers across the ancient world, psychological armor. A 3rd century BC amulet now displayed in the Bardo Museum shows Tanit's crescent symbol alongside a simple inscription, not a spell, but a soldier's name and unit. These were identification tags as much as talismans, ensuring fallen fighters could be identified if their bodies were recovered. But why the invincibility legends? Look to the Battle of Cannae, where Hannibal's troops endured hours of brutal combat against superior Roman numbers. Contemporary accounts describe Carthaginian lines reforming with eerie discipline under fire, a feat Romans attributed to dark magic rather than superior training. Their unbreakable myth also served Roman propaganda. What better excuse for repeated defeats than claiming your enemy cheated with divine intervention? Modern analysis of the amulet's metallurgy debunks the wildest claims. Many were hollow, filled with substances like ash or herbs, likely personal relics or medicinal packets, not arcane batteries. Some even bear workshop stamps, proof they were mass-produced for rank and file troops, not hand-forged by priests. The real magic wasn't in the metal. It was in the unshakable belief that something no bigger than a coin could tilt fate in your favor, a placebo effect powerful enough to make men charge into certain death. That's the true sorcery Carthage mastered, not crafting invincible soldiers, but convincing them they might be. The myth that Carthage boasted hanging gardens to rival Babylon's is a delicious case of historical déjà vu, one that says more about our love of legendary wonders than actual Punic landscaping. Ancient travelers returning from the Mediterranean would swear they'd seen tiered gardens cascading down Carthage's Biasa hill, their vines spilling over stone parapets like something straight out of Nebuchadnezzar's playbook. Even medieval mapmakers got in on the act, sketching fantastical greenery tumbling toward the sea. But the truth, Carthage's gardens were impressive, just not in the way the legends suggest. Archaeology reveals a city that mastered practical horticulture, not fairy tale botany. Excavations uncovered extensive terraced gardens, yes, but these were functional marvels designed to maximize scarce arable land on Carthage's hilly terrain. Farmers carved stepped plots into slopes, using gravity-fed irrigation channels to distribute water from rooftop cisterns. Olive and pomegranate trees thrived in these microclimates, their roots stabilizing the soil against erosion. It was ingenious farming, not aesthetic theater. The confusion with Babylon likely sprouted from Roman exaggerations. After conquering Carthage, generals eager to magnify their triumph borrowed the hanging gardens imagery from Mesopotamia, grafting one empire's glory onto another's ruins. The real smoking gun. No Carthaginian texts or inscriptions mention hanging gardens, while Babylonian records meticulously document theirs. Even Strabo, who described Babylon's wonders in detail, only mentions Carthage's gardens as productive. But the myth persists because it feeds our craving for symmetry, the idea that every great civilization must have a botanical crown jewel, the irony. Carthage's actual gardens were arguably more revolutionary. Their terrace designs influenced Roman villas and later Islamic agriculture, turning barren hills into breadbaskets. That's the real wonder, not vines dangling dramatically, but a people who made the land itself defy expectations. So next time you picture Carthage's greenery, forget Babylon. Imagine instead the quiet genius of farmers turning slopes into sustenance, proof that sometimes history's most grounded achievements outgrow its tallest tales. Fishermen off Tunisia's Cape Bon still cross themselves when the fog rolls in because some swear the ghostly outlines of Carthaginian warships emerge from the mist, their oars slicing silently through waves that don't ripple. These aren't just drunken sailor tales. For centuries, locals and sailors have reported eerie encounters with phantom galleys, their decks eerily empty yet moving with purpose, as if guided by unseen hands. The most chilling accounts describe bronze rams glinting beneath the moonlight, though no ship has sailed these waters with such weapons in over 2,000 years. The legends cluster around one stretch of coastline where Carthage's navy once dominated near modern-day Calibia, where underwater archaeology confirms the seabed is littered with ancient shipwrecks. Sonar scans reveal at least a dozen Punic-era vessels resting in the silt, their hulls preserved by the Mediterranean's salty depths. Some sit upright as if frozen mid-voyage, while others are shattered relics of Rome's final siege. It's no wonder stories persist. When storms churn the sand, locals whisper that the dead ships awaken, their timbers groaning as they rise briefly from their graves. But science offers a less spectral explanation. The Cape Bon Peninsula is a notorious collision point for warm and cold currents, creating sudden banks of sea fog that can distort light and sound. A modern fishing boat glimpsed through this haze might stretch into the elongated silhouette of an ancient galley, especially when imagination primes the eyes. Even the bronze rams could be tricks of the light sunbeams striking sunken debris just right, creating momentary illusions. Yet the stories endure because they tap into something deeper than optics. Carthage's navy was its lifeblood, and its destruction was so total that even the sea seemed to mourn. Fishermen passing wrecks might unconsciously channel that legacy, their tales keeping alive a civilization Rome tried to erase. So are the ghost ships real, maybe not as phantoms but as echoes of a lost world that refuses to sink quietly into history's abyss. The truth may lie somewhere between barnacles and belief. After all, the best legends aren't born from thin air. They rise from the deep where broken hulls and human memory intertwine. One of the most persistent modern myths about Carthage insists they sailed to the Americas long before Columbus, a claim that resurfaces every few years when someone discovers a suspiciously Carthaginian-looking artifact in a Virginia field or a Brazilian cave. The theory goes like this: with their legendary naval prowess, Punic sailors must have crossed the Atlantic, leaving behind mysterious inscriptions and copper tools that baffle archaeologists. It's a tantalizing idea, but the reality is far less Hollywood. First, let's dismantle the so-called evidence. The infamous Bat Creek stone, found in Tennessee in the 1880s, bears an inscription some swear is Punic. Never mind that professional linguists consistently identify it as a 19th century hoax, likely carved by a local Masonic group familiar with Semitic scripts. Then there's the Paraíba inscription from Brazil, a supposed Phoenician text describing storm-tossed sailors until scholars pointed out its grammar was closer to a garbled dictionary than any known ancient language. These artifacts share one trait: they're always found by amateurs, never in controlled archaeological layers where context could verify their age. Now, contrast this with what we know Carthage's ships actually achieved. Their verified trade routes were staggering in scope, from the tin mines of Cornwall to the gold dust of West Africa. A Carthaginian explorer named Hannibal even sailed down Africa's Atlantic coast, leaving behind a periplus so detailed it mentions gorillas and volcanic peaks. But here's the catch: every documented voyage hugged coastlines or hopped between visible islands. The open Atlantic was a psychological and technological barrier. Carthaginian ships, though advanced for their time, lacked the deep-hulled design and navigational tools needed for transatlantic crossings. Their galleys were built for the Mediterranean's predictable winds, not the North Atlantic's fury. So why does this myth persist? Partly because we want history to be more interconnected than it was. The idea of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact scratches an itch for hidden narratives, for civilizations whispering to each other across oceans. It also plays into outdated stereotypes, the mysterious Phoenicians as blank slates for our fantasies, rather than real people who calculated risks as carefully as profit margins. The irony: Carthage's actual maritime feats are breathtaking enough without inventing extras. They circumnavigated Africa when most Greeks thought the world ended at Gibraltar. They turned the Mediterranean into a Punic lake for centuries. That's the real wonder, not phantom voyages to America, but a mastery of the possible so complete it still feels like magic. Carthage's legacy isn't just written in stone or scorched earth. It's woven into the wildest corners of imagination, where history and myth collide like triremes in a storm. We've traced whispers of infant sacrifices to the charred urns of the Tophet, peeled back the layers of Hannibal's haunted ghost story, and even watched as a city's mundane sewer system morphed into a minotaur's labyrinth. But here's the twist: every myth, no matter how outlandish, carries a sliver of truth. Carthage didn't salt its earth, but Rome did try to erase it. Their engineers didn't harness dragon's blood, but they did coat ships in pine tar so revolutionary it might as well have been magic. These legends didn't sprout from nowhere. They grew from the gaps left by conquerors who burned libraries along with temples. That's the real power of Carthage's story. When a civilization is dismantled so thoroughly, its memory becomes a blank canvas for fear, awe, and sometimes outright fiction. Romans painted their rivals as serpent-worshipping barbarians to justify annihilation. Medieval scribes turned Dido into a sword-swinging queen because the idea of a woman founding a city through diplomacy alone was too radical. Even today, we project our fantasies onto Carthage, whether it's transatlantic voyages or Atlantis connections, because the human mind craves mysteries more than mundane ledgers. But the truth is far more compelling. This was a people who navigated by the stars while Rome still feared the open sea, who turned snail mucus into an empire's currency, and whose defeat was so total, we're left sifting through ashes for whispers of their brilliance. So next time you hear a historical fact that feels too strange to be true, ask yourself, who wrote it and why? Carthage reminds us that history belongs not just to the victors, but to the storytellers, and sometimes the most enduring lies reveal more than the sanitized truth. If unraveling these myths taught us anything, it's that the past is never just a timeline. It's a battleground of memory where legends outlast empires. And if you're hungry for more tales where history and mystery collide, hit that subscribe button, because the ancient world has plenty of secrets left to spill.